Welcome to our new little podcast. I'm Zach.
And I'm Nicole.
In today's episode, we're going to be looking at the recent changes at the state level of voter laws and the requirements for it.
So, the big one that everybody's been talking about is the Georgia bill, which is called the Election Integrity Act of 2021. Obviously, Georgia had a lot of big changes in the election this year, so they voted for Biden as a state, and then they elected two new Democratic senators. So, their state legislature is still Republican controlled. So in light of the 2020 election, they decided to pass this big bill to try to prevent voter fraud, is what they're claiming. But obviously, we don't really agree with that. So
Yeah, it definitely looks a little weird. There's some things in it that I kind of understand. They have and they impose new voter ID requirements for absentee ballots, which I guess, yeah, you want to prevent future fraud in elections, but many studies have showed that election there wasn't really any fraud that could have done significant damage to the election.
yeah, the thing for me is like there's no reason to even pass this bill because there was no evidence of voter fraud. Like Republicans can say that there was as much as they want, but there's no proof.
Yeah, it's almost like a ploy from Donald Trump to start his revival of his Republican Party in 2022. He said earlier that he was going to push out officials to be elected, and this is probably the first step in that whole process.
Yeah, so I mean, even if some parts of this bill don't suppress any voters, they're still unnecessary because there's not a lot of voter fraud to prevent from what we saw in the 2020 election.
Yeah, and this bill went, I think, a little too far in preventing fraud. One of the key parts of the bill was it's a crime now to approach voters in line to give them food and water. That's just inhumane.
Yeah, I think that's the worst part of it to me because how is that going to prevent voter fraud? And if people are waiting for long times in line, like they shouldn't have to suffer.
Yeah, and that goes for both Democrats and Republicans. No matter who you're going to vote for, it's actually illegal to get food and water while in line. And I like how the GOP led legislature in Georgia saw no problem with that at all.
Yeah, I don't get the point of that at all. So like if I'm trying to give people water while they're waiting in a hot voter line because it's Georgia, I could be arrested for that?
That's what it seems in the bill, and that just shows how crazy it is.
And I don't get it. I just don't get it at all. And it's like it might be easy to think, well, food and water isn't that necessary because it doesn't take that long to vote, but like this past election, I know in local areas in Pennsylvania, there were like 4-hour lines to vote.
Yeah.
So
Oh yeah, and especially now that Georgia, with that bill, is limiting drop box ballots for these votes, meaning there's gonna be less places to vote at. Those lines are gonna be longer, and it's actually kind of confusing why Republicans are trying to like limit the ballots out there, as high turnout has seemed to always help the Republican Party.
well, I mean, if they're taking away the ballot drop boxes, that's not going to affect the Republican voters. It's more likely to affect the Democrat voters. So, like, when I say that I think this is suppressing voters, it's not just indiscriminately suppressing any Georgia voter. It's going to suppress minority votes, low income votes, like Democrat votes. And obviously, that's exactly what the Republicans want.
Yeah, and it's hard to prove that right now with just passing this bill because it just looks like the GOP is passing this as a whole. But once we actually start seeing these elections and see where these drop boxes are being removed from, it's going to easily show that there is some form of suppression here.
Yeah, that's the one thing I'm really interested to see because I know, again, in this past election, when they removed ballot drop boxes and like polling locations, or voting locations, it was mostly in like low income POC communities. So I don't think it's just randomly where they're taking these voting places away.
Yeah, and I know we targeted Georgia, but it's not even just Georgia doing these voter suppression. 253 bills have been introduced in 43 different states, and that goes for blue and red states.
And so, like, even some of those bills that maybe don't have a potential to suppress voters, again, they're just unnecessary. It's a waste of time because there was no evidence of any voter fraud or like any wide scale voter fraud.
Yeah, and there's fraud in every election going back to the dawns of George Washington and John Adams. There's always been some form of fraud, but the fraud has never been statistically significant enough to affect the results of the election.
And obviously, it's going to be different to see with like absentee ballots how this changes. But I know I heard about a study for like starting in 2000 and it went to like 2018 or something. So it was like a huge, huge study. And they found that requiring voter ID prevented like zero cases of voter fraud. Like it just doesn't work, it doesn't do anything.
Yeah, it's just not as effective as the GOP party thinks it is. And even though Georgia voted blue on the national level, still very red. States like Arizona that they lost to blue, they also have the same amount of bills introduced to their own GOP legislature, and even PA with a blue governor, their GOP legislature has proposed 15 bills.
Yeah, so it's like a lot of states are passing these bills, and the ones that are proposing the most voter fraud prevention bills are the ones where they're starting to go blue, but their state legislator is still red.
Yeah, the state there's 23 states in the United States that are Republican controlled at both the governor and legislature level, and those are the states that we're going to see probably pass the most voter suppression laws.
Yeah, obviously, like this past election, we saw a lot of changes in like states, swing states leaning more blue, and states like Georgia where we have been expecting them to be a red state, and now they're leaning blue. And so I feel like in the areas where Republicans still have holds on those states, they're going to do whatever they can to prevent it from fully going blue. And maybe that's suppressing voters, maybe that's taking ballot boxes away from like low income communities. So I feel like not only this bill to me is bad on two levels. First of all, it's unnecessary, and second of all, it's going to suppress voters and make it harder to vote.
Yeah, I believe that it's kind of interesting how this happened after the 2020 election. I think if Donald Trump wasn't such a key figure in the party right now, that none of these laws would have been even introduced. His claim for widespread voter fraud are the only reason why these laws are even being considered right now.
Yeah, and I mean, I think both parties obviously when they lose, they're gonna want to give reasons for why, and they're gonna want to be like, oh, but we were still the better person. But to just say, oh, well, we only lost because it was fraud, like, this is so ridiculous to me. I didn't really phrase that right, but all this garbage is just so stupid.
Yeah, and when we looked on back to election day when Donald Trump claimed, the fraud happened because overnight he lost the mail-in ballots had 500,000 votes for Biden but only 100,000 for him. In like states like Michigan, you got to look at the state of Florida and Texas. They started counting those mail-in ballots and Biden was up by significant margins. He was up 60-40, 55-45. But he ended up losing those states because later on both those states respectively then counted in the in-person ballots. So the same goes if PA would have counted the in-person ballots first, like they did, Trump showed up. If they counted mail-in ballots first, Biden would have had to lead the whole way.
And that's just kind of common sense because it was a fact that Democrats were voting more by mail in ballots and absentee ballots. So obviously, if you count those first, Democrats are going to be in the lead first. If you count them second, they're going to take the lead later on. Like, that's not fraud, that's just logic.
Yeah, and a lot of Democrats, they turned to these mail-in ballots due to the coronavirus, and Joe Biden really wanted them to use this to, keep social distancing. And this was at a time where COVID was very high in America. The death rates were going up, the positive tests were going up, so they just wanted to play it safe.
Yeah, and again, not to make everything like red versus blue, but there's a party who cares more about COVID restrictions and who has been more COVID safe and more pro mask, and it's not the Republican Party.
Yeah, it's definitely not there, but when we look at this voter suppression, it's going to be interesting to see how these next few elections go, especially with, a Georgia Senate election in 2022 where Warnock is going to have to face another Republican. And we're going to see these voter suppression laws in effect because a good amount of them are going to pass. Not all of them will pass, not all 253 in all these 43 states, but a significant amount in certain red controlled states are going to pass voter suppression laws.
And they're going to stay in effect because, like this Georgia one, there's been a lot of nationwide opposition to it. But I really don't think anything's going to change because, I mean, in order to get it, like, reversed or ruled unconstitutional, you would have to prove that there's a racist intent. And I don't think they're going to be able to prove that, even if the results are going to, affect POC people more.
Yeah, it's definitely too hard to prove that there was an intent to target Democrats, target minorities at like a statistically significant level. As a community and population, we all know that they're going to be targeted, but when it comes to politics and the law constitutionally, it's going to be very hard to cite that.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, regardless of the fact that a lot of people are speaking out about it, it's passed, and I think it's going to stay, the Georgia one, and the other subsequent ones that might pass in other states.
Yeah, and states like Arizona and Florida are taking this Georgia one and using it as leverage in their own legislatures and are going to pretty much model the bill itself.
Yeah, absolutely. This is going to be an inspiration for other, GOP state legislators.
Yeah. And like I said, these next elections are really going to determine how much voter suppression these laws are going to really affect elections. And it's going to be interesting to see how minority and Democrat turnout shifts within these elections.
Yeah, to give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe this won't affect anything too much, but I kind of doubt that, and I would really like to see like polling and data on the effect this bill makes.
I agree with the GOP party where we do with these mail-in ballots, we need to make sure that there is no fraud occurring. I understand that. And totally, there should never be any fraud in any election. I think we should take the steps to do that. However, some of the steps that the GOP party is taking, especially in Georgia, are a bit too far for me to even cope with and sometimes even understand. And I know I said this millions of times, but I'm still getting over the food and water in the line. That's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if they had to give a reason, it's like if you take water from a Democrat, they might encourage you to vote for a Democrat, or vice versa with a Republican. But like, if they both have an equal chance to give people food and water, I feel like that's not gonna make people switch parties or whatever.
Yeah, and it also just shows how polarized our nation is getting between red and blue. Because for the longest time, red and blue was very close to each other, but now they're on the whole opposite spectrum, at the majority level at least.
And that's another, that reminded me of another thing to note with this. It was completely split on party lines in the Georgia legislature. So, only Republicans voted for this, not a single Democrat. So obviously it's not just voter suppression bipartisan bill. It's a Republican bill.
Yeah, and as the Republican controls many state legislatures, these in the next few weeks, the amount of bills that are going to be passed is just going to keep going up, and it's going to be interesting to see what these legislatures pass. As always, we thank you for listening to our New Deal podcast. I'm Zach.
And I'm Nicole.